All right, guys, let's dive in to this immersed journey. Baptism has been something of a controversy amongst Christ followers, disagreeing on how and when and what should happen with it. That's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to understand the meaning behind it. What is it supposed to communicate to us by doing this action of baptism? The first thing we got to start with was, what does the word mean? Not what does it mean to us now? You know, like, oh, baptism, it sounds like bath. So, well, and you're not too far off from that idea. But we need to look back at Scripture, understand where it came from and the languages that it came from when it comes to Scripture. So we've got two different words for it. We've got a Hebrew word and a Greek word. And so these two words for Hebrew and Greek, the Hebrew word is tevila, and then the Greek word is baptismos, which sounds very similar to baptism. And both of them mean the same thing. It means to be immersed. To be immersed, specifically in water, but it could be in anything. And so what does immersed mean? Immersed means to be plunged into, or to be covered by, to be surrounded by, to be soaked into something. So when we look at baptism, we're not just talking, obviously, about, hey, you know what? I got dunked in some water, because you do that in your bathtub or in a swimming pool or whatever. It's what that physical act means. Baptism itself is an act of worship to express our devotion to following Christ. It's a way to show others around us what's going on in our hearts already, or in fact, what we want to see happening in our hearts. It's a decision to say that I am actually going to be surrounded, immersed, completely sunk into this following of Christ. It's not something that earns you some space. It's not because I got baptized, now this thing, now I'm okay, or I'm good, or I'm clean. And there's all of these different analogies that Scripture uses for baptism, and different ways we can understand what this physical act represents. And I've heard the argument all the time as well. Okay, so do I have to be baptized to be saved, or this? And I think this idea, like, to ask that question completely misses the point of baptism altogether. I mean, just think about it a second. After all, we've already said we don't want religion. We don't want to be hypocrites, obviously, either. But we don't want just a religion. We want a deep connection, meaningful relationship with God through Christ, walking out and following the path that He's laid for us. So if we want it like a relationship, let's think about it a little bit like a relationship. I'm married. I've been married for about 17 years now. And if I was to go to my wife and maybe when we got married, or even later on, and I said, hey, so to be married to you, I don't have to come home every night though, right? Like, what do I have to do? Like, where's the line that, like, I'm married, but I've done enough to, like, say I'm married? No, we would all look at that and say, well, that's kind of crazy, because you're wanting to be married to this person. So we need to look at it that way, and we need to stop and ask ourselves, how many times do we ask questions about something that Christ has asked us to do in following Him, or God's asked us to do, and that we're trying to draw that line and say, well, how far do I have to go? It's immersed in it. It's to be sunk and dive completely into it. And baptism is that relational aspect of saying, I've decided to do this. And it's got so many analogies about cleansing and laying from life to death, and we're going to dive into all of them. And so this physical act is meant to teach us, to show us. It's an analogy in and of itself that we can look at in the natural world, an action we can see in the natural, and it shows us something spiritually. But also the actual physical act teaches us something of the character of Christ. And what it teaches us with this is something called humility, or to lay down our pride. Because oftentimes we're asked to do things to follow Christ in a way, and it requires us to lay down our own pride. So if we're ever thinking, well, I don't have to do that, remember, we're thinking of this all wrong at that point. We're looking at this very religious of, I'm trying to earn something or do something, versus I'm following along with Christ. I'm covered in His dust. I'm following right behind Him. And you know what? If we look in the Gospels, we will see the account of Jesus' own baptism, which we're going to talk about later on. And He says, I must be baptized. And John the Baptist actually says, no. And John the Baptist had to actually submit himself and be humble to Christ to say, okay, well, this is the way. And Christ had to humble Himself to the will of God to do this. And that's why we see, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased. Now, we're going to dive into that much later on in more detail. But it's to show us and to actually teach us humility in the act of doing it as well. So I think that kind of shows us the basics of what baptism is, this physical act of being submerged in water that represents something very spiritual that's either already happened in our lives and is happening in our lives, or that we desire to happen, and we're making a decision to say, I am now going to be covered in the dust of Jesus' feet because I'm walking right behind him.